Mrs. Lon was an elderly woman living in a small, modest house in a peaceful countryside village. Her life had seen its share of ups and downs, but the greatest heartbreak was losing her beloved husband, Mr. High, in a sudden accident over 20 years ago. Since his passing, she had carried the weight of her loss quietly, raising her children and keeping the memories of her husband alive. To her, the pain of missing him remained as fresh as the day he left. Her house, though simple, was filled with memories of Mr. High, the chair where he used to sit and read, the wooden table where they shared countless cups of tea, and the old photograph of him resting on the altar. All reminded her of the happy days they had shared. Every day Mrs. Lant followed a routine. After her simple breakfast, she would sit by the window, gazing out at the fields in the distance. Those fields held special meaning to her. They were where she and Mr. High often strolled hand in hand during their younger days. In her hands, she always held an old photograph of Mr. High. The picture had yellowed with time, its edges worn, but it was her most treasured possession. She would sometimes run her fingers over the photo, as if she could still feel his presence. His eyes in the photograph, warm and kind, seemed to gaze back at her, just as they had in life. Her neighbors often said Mrs. Land lived in solitude, but she didn't feel lonely. To her, the memories of Mr. High were the greatest comfort. She would talk to him as if he were still there, sharing stories about their children and grandchildren. In those quiet moments, she felt as though he were listening, protecting her from afar. Even though she knew Mr. High was no longer with her, Mrs. Land believed that the love they shared had never faded. It lived on in every corner of their home, in every keepsake, and most importantly, in her heart. What she didn't expect, however, was what came next, a mysterious calling from the other side, as if her beloved husband had never truly left. On quiet late nights, when everyone in the house was fast asleep, Mrs. Lan often lay alone on her old wooden bed. The faint light of an oil lamp cast her shadow on the wall. The silence was so profound that she could hear every whisper of the wind outside the window and the chirping of insects from the garden behind the house. But amidst this stillness, something strange happened. It was a voice, gentle yet clear, familiar as though it came from the depths of her memories. "Lan? Lan?" Mrs. Lan startled awake, her heart pounding. It wasn't a dream. It was a real voice. The voice of Mr. High, her husband, who had passed away over 20 years ago. The first time she heard it, she thought she was imagining things. Perhaps she missed him so much that her mind conjured up the sound of his voice. But no, the voice came again and again, every night at the same time. It called out, soft but unmistakably real, as if Mr. High were standing just outside her door. Stranger still, only she could hear it. She told her children, but no one believed her. They all thought it was just the imagination of an old woman living in solitude. Yet Mrs. Lan knew she wasn't mistaken. That voice was unmistakable. It had been her companion for a lifetime, from the early days when they built a family together to the day he left this world. Each time she heard the voice, she didn't feel frightened. Instead, she felt a strange sense of peace, as though Mr. High was drawing near, reassuring her that she wasn't alone. She lay quietly, her eyes gazing into the dark corner of the room, where she imagined his figure might be. In her heart, she wondered, is he waiting for me? Has the time come for me to see him again? One quiet night, as the dim light of an oil lamp cast faint shadows on the wall, Mrs. Land drifted into a deep sleep. This sleep was more than just rest for her body. It seemed like a doorway to another realm, where reality and dreams intertwined seamlessly. In her dream, she found herself standing in the middle of a vast field of vibrant flowers. The blossoms swayed gently in the soft breeze, releasing a soothing fragrance that filled the air. She felt a profound sense of peace and warmth, as if the entire world had paused just for her. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was Mr. High. He looked exactly as she remembered. Kind eyes, a serene face, and that gentle smile that always made her feel safe. He walked toward her, his gaze never leaving hers, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Softly, he said, "Lan, don't be afraid. It's time for us to be together again." His voice carried no sadness or fear, only tenderness and love. Mrs. Lan stood silently, absorbing every word, every breath, as though he had never truly left her. She felt no fear, nor did she feel the need to ask any questions. Instead, a deep sense of peace blossomed within her. She didn't speak, only smiled at him. In that moment, she understood that her time in this world was nearing its end. She realized this dream wasn't just a fleeting illusion, but a message, a gentle preparation for her final journey. When she woke the next morning, the dream remained vivid in her mind. But instead of fear or worry, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief and readiness. Her heart was filled with tranquility, as though she had found the answer to the questions she had carried for so long. 3 days before her passing, Mrs. Lan sat on her old wooden bed, the faint glow of an oil lamp softly illuminating her kind face. Her children gathered around her in the small, cozy room. The atmosphere was warm yet filled with a quiet sense of unease. Mrs. Lan had called them together, knowing it was time to share her final thoughts. With a gentle but firm voice, she began, "My dear children, there's something important I need to tell you. In the past few days, I've been hearing a voice. It's your father's voice. He's been calling me, his voice so familiar, as if he's standing right next to me. And last night I had a dream about him." The room fell silent. Her children sat motionless, listening intently. Mrs. Lan continued, her eyes gazing into the distance as if reliving the dream. "In my dream, I was standing in a field of flowers. In the distance, your father appeared walking toward me. He looked at me with that same gentle smile I've always known. He said, 'Lan, don't be afraid. It's time for us to be together again.'" Her eldest son, his voice trembling with emotion, asked, "Mother, are you afraid?" Mrs. Lan smiled softly, her gaze warm and reassuring as she looked around the room. "Afraid? No, my child. I've lived my life to the fullest. Now I feel an extraordinary sense of peace, as if your father is waiting for me somewhere close, ready to guide me on this new journey." Her children couldn't hold back their tears. One of her daughters reached out, clasping her hand tightly, and whispered, "Mother, we'll miss you so much." Mrs. Lan held each of their hands in turn, her eyes filled with love and tenderness. "I know, my children, but promise me this. Live your lives with happiness. Don't let sorrow weigh you down. Always remember that your father and I will be watching over you." From a place of great peace, the small room fell into a profound stillness, broken only by the soft rustle of wind outside the window. Mrs. Lan's words were not just a farewell, but a testament of love and encouragement for the children she had devoted her entire life to. In the dim light, the image of Mrs. Lan, surrounded by her family, became a sacred moment, a memory that would stay with them forever. That night, the air in Mrs. Lan's room was filled with a profound stillness. Her family sat around her bed, their eyes full of worry and love. Mrs. Lan lay there peacefully, her breath shallow but calm, showing no signs of pain. Time seemed to stand still, allowing everyone to cherish the final moments with her. Suddenly, a gentle breeze swept through the room. It was strange because all the windows had been tightly shut to keep out the night's chill. The breeze seemed to carry more than just air. It brought a sense of tenderness, as if it came from a distant place unseen by the living. At that moment, Mrs. Lan slightly opened her eyes. A serene smile appeared on her face, soft and tranquil. Her gaze seemed to focus on something far away, something only she could see. She didn't speak a word, but quietly exhaled her final breath. Her family, holding her hands, could feel her slipping away from this world. The silence in the room was profound, yet it was not filled with fear or overwhelming sorrow. Instead, a sense of peace enveloped everyone, as if she had found what she had been waiting for: to reunite with Mr. Hai, her husband, who had been waiting for her all these years. After Mrs. Lan passed, her children began to sort through her belongings to prepare for her farewell ceremony. While tidying up, they found an old photograph of Mr. Hai, carefully kept in a small wooden box that Mrs. Lan had treasured. It was a photo of him on their wedding day, smiling brightly with eyes full of love. What struck them the most was a message, written by Mrs. Lan on the back of the photo long ago. "Mr. Hai, I will join you soon." Holding the photo, the children felt a wave of emotions, grief mixed with profound understanding. They realized that throughout her life, Mrs. Lon had never stopped loving or missing Mr. High, and now she had finally fulfilled her promise to be reunited with him in a place where love endures forever. Thank you for listening to this heartfelt story. If you enjoy stories about love, life, and the wonders of the world, please follow our channel. This is where we share profound, inspiring stories that bring meaningful moments to your day. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your own story with us. Every subscription and support from you motivates us to continue this journey. We sincerely thank you and look forward to seeing you in our next videos.